The whispers in Pine Hollow had a way of cutting deeper than the February wind. They said Rowan Blackwood was less a man and more a force of nature, a mountain-dwelling devil who had traded his soul for the ability to survive where other men withered. To the townspeople, he was a ghost of the high peaks, a silent predator who settled his grievances with cold lead and buried his history beneath the eternal drifts of the Wyoming wilderness. The stories told around the pot-bellied stoves in the general store cast him as a monster, a man who had survived the war only to lose his humanity in the jagged shadows of the Tetons. When the news broke that Clara Hayes was to be his bride, the town didn't prepare a celebration. They prepared a vigil. They gathered at the small, weathered church not to witness a union of love, but to watch the final act of a tragedy. To them, Clara wasn't walking toward a marriage bed. She was walking toward a shallow grave in the high country, and they wanted to see if the mountain man would truly claim his prize or simply extinguish the last light of the Hayes family. Inside the cramped vestry, the air was stagnant and smelled of damp wool and old wood. Clara Hayes stood before a silvered mirror that was as fractured as her future. The dress she wore was a borrowed thing, a lace-trimmed garment that belonged to the schoolteacher's wife, and it felt like a shroud. It was too loose in the shoulders, hanging like a weight, yet it constricted her ribs until every breath felt like a struggle against the fabric. She looked at her reflection, at the pale skin and the eyes that had seen too much loss in too short a time, and felt like a child playing a cruel game of dress-up. A wilted rose plucked from a dying winter garden pricked her finger as she tried to pin it to her bodice. A single bead of crimson bloomed on the white lace, spreading slowly like an omen. Everything about this day was stained by the shadow of debt. She wasn't a bride, she was a payment. She was the final coin her father, Thomas Hayes, had to spend to keep the wolves from their door, and the realization tasted like ash in her mouth. The door creaked open, admitting a draft of cold air and the broken figure of her father. Thomas Hayes looked as though the mountains themselves had collapsed onto his shoulders. His eyes were bloodshot, his hands trembling with a palsy that no amount of whiskey could soothe. He had been a man of pride once, a rancher who knew the language of the land, but the card tables in Copper Ridge had spoken a different tongue, one of ruin. He had gambled away the cattle, then the timber, and finally the very dirt they stood upon. When Harlan Crow, the local land baron with the soul of a vulture, had come to collect, Thomas had found himself staring into the abyss. Crow didn't just want the ranch, he wanted Clara, a companion for his sprawling estate, a prospect that was a death sentence of a different kind. Rowan Blackwood had been the only other option, a man who offered to clear the debts in exchange for a wife to keep his mountain cabin. "I'm sorry, Clara," Thomas whispered, his voice cracking like dry timber. "I never meant for it to come to this." Clara did not turn to look at him. If she saw the tears in his eyes, she might break, and she needed to be made of iron today. "You never meant to lose the ranch," she said, her voice a hollow echo in the small room. "You never meant to borrow from men who trade in blood. You never meant for Harlan Crow to stand at our gate with papers claiming ownership of my life. But you did it all the same, Father. You traded me from one wolf to another, hoping the second one has a softer bite." She thought of Crow, a man of 63 with eyes like flint and a reputation for breaking the women who entered his house. Rowan Blackwood was an enigma, a violent shadow, but Crow was a known evil. In the hierarchy of devils, she had chosen the one who lived in the silence of the peaks rather than the one who sat in the front row of the church, smiling like a predator. Through the walls, she could hear the murmur of the crowd, the voyeurs of Pine Hollow waiting for the spectacle to begin. The walk down the center aisle felt like a descent into a canyon where the sun never reached. Every eye in the church was await. She saw the pity in Mrs. Patterson's gaze and the dark curiosity in the faces of the Garrett children. Sarah Dennison, once her closest friend, hid behind a gloved hand, whispering to her mother as Clara passed. They were all there to witness the transaction. At the front of the sanctuary, standing beside a visibly sweating Reverend Morris, was the man who had bought her freedom from Crow. Rowan Blackwood was not the gnarled, aging beast the rumors had suggested. He was a pillar of shadow and bone, perhaps 30 years of age, with shoulders that seemed to hold up the very rafters of the church. He wore a dark coat that looked stiff and new, and his black hair brushed against a collar that seemed to chafe him. But it was his eyes that arrested her. They were the color of a winter storm, grey and turbulent, yet as he looked at her she saw no triumph. There was only a heavy, haunting sense of regret. When they reached the altar, Thomas Hayes's hand slipped from her arm, leaving her stranded in the silence. Rowan reached out, his hand large and calloused from years of mountain toil, but his touch was unexpectedly light. As his fingers closed around hers, he leaned in, his voice a low vibration that barely reached her ears. "I am sorry it had to be this way," he murmured. The apology was a jolt to her system. Of all the things she expected from a mountain killer, remorse was not among them. Reverend Morris began the liturgy, the words "dearly beloved" ringing hollow in the rafters. Clara felt the presence of Harlan Crowe at the back of the room, a looming shadow of gold and greed, watching to see if his prize would truly slip away. When the question was asked, Rowan's "I do" was a vow that sounded like a command to the world to back away. When it was her turn, Clara looked into those storm-grey eyes and whispered her assent, the words tasting like the first frost of autumn. The ceremony was devoid of the traditional joy that usually filled the Pine Hollow church. There was no kiss, no celebratory cheer, only the heavy finality of a contract being sealed. As Rowan led her back down the aisle, his arm was like a bar of iron, providing a strange sort of security against the judging glares of the townspeople. Outside, the February air hit them like a physical blow, the sky a bruised purple over the jagged teeth of the mountains. A sturdy wagon waited at the edge of the churchyard, loaded with enough supplies to survive a siege. Thomas Hayes stood by the hitch, clutching a leather portfolio containing the deeds to his ranch, now free and clear, paid for by the man who was now Clara's husband. "Take care of the land, Thomas," Rowan said, his voice hard, "and don't ever gamble with what isn't yours again." With a final, empty look at her father, Clara climbed into the wagon, leaving behind the only life she had ever known to follow a stranger into the heart of the winter. The wagon wheels creaked a rhythmic morning song against the frozen ruts of the mountain road as Pine Hollow began to shrink into a collection of dollhouses in the valley below. For Clara, the departure felt less like a journey and more like a shedding of skin. Every familiar landmark, the leaning fence of the Miller farm, the soot-stained chimney of the blacksmith's forge, the skeletal branches of the hanging tree at the edge of town, was a tether being severed. Rowan Blackwood sat beside her, a mountain of wool and leather, his hands steady on the reins as he guided the two dark-coated horses into the ascending mist. He didn't speak, but his presence was an overwhelming weight, a gravity that pulled her away from the world of soft beds and neighborly gossip. The horses' breath came in ragged plumes of white, and the higher they climbed, the more the air took on a razor-like edge that stung the lungs. The silence between them was thick, populated only by the sound of the wind through the lodgepole pines and the occasional clatter of a loose stone falling into the abyss beside the narrow trail. Clara clutched her shawl, feeling the thinness of the fabric and the cold reality that she was now bound to a man who lived where the world ended. As they navigated the treacherous switchbacks of the range, Clara found herself studying her husband from the corner of her eye. Rowan didn't possess the frantic, whiskey-soaked energy of her father, nor the predatory, oily charm of Harlan Crowe. There was a quiet competence in the way he adjusted the tension on the lines, a sense of deep-rooted awareness that suggested he was constantly reading the mountain like a familiar map. His eyes never rested. They scanned the ridgelines for movement and the snow for tracks, revealing the instincts of a man who had survived the frontier by assuming everything was a threat. This was the mountain devil of the town's legends, yet up close the violence seemed tucked away, replaced by a grim professional focus. The landscape changed as they rose, the deciduous trees of the lowlands giving way to the dark, oppressive green of subalpine firs and the ghostly peeling bark of ancient aspens. The world was becoming a study in monochrome, shadows of charcoal, peaks of blinding white, and a sky the color of a bruised plum. Every mile was a deeper dive into a wilderness that didn't care for human debts or legal papers, a place where survival was the only currency that truly mattered. The sun began its slow, inevitable slide behind the jagged western peaks, casting long, skeletal shadows across the drifts. Just as the twilight began to turn the snow into shades of deep cobalt and violet, the cabin finally emerged from the gloom. It was a structure of heavy, hand-hewn logs, backed against a sheer cliff face that offered protection from the northern gales. It didn't look like the derelict hovel the gossips had described. Instead, it was a sturdy fortress of survival, its stones mortared with precision and its roof built to withstand the crushing weight of a high-country winter. A thin coil of smoke rose from the chimney, a sign that a fire had been banked recently, though the clearing seemed deserted. As the wagon came to a halt, a man stepped out from the shadows of the porch, a rifle cradled in his arm with casual familiarity. This was Marcus, a man with a graying beard and a limp that suggested a lifetime of hard miles. He looked at Clara with a mixture of pity and curiosity, a look she was becoming well acquainted with. "So you actually went through with it, Rowan?" Marcus asked, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "I did," Rowan replied, his voice flat. "Is the perimeter clear?" Marcus nodded, but his gaze remained on Clara. "Crow knows. He was at the church, hidden in the back. He's not a man to let a prize go without a fight. Watch your back, brother." With those cryptic words, Marcus gathered his belongings and disappeared into the gathering dusk, leaving a silence that felt heavier than the snow. Rowan began to unload the wagon, moving with a strength that seemed effortless as he hauled Clara's single trunk onto the porch. She followed him into the cabin, her legs stiff and trembling from the hours of cold. Inside, she braced herself for the filth of a bachelor's lair, but the reality was a jarring contradiction to the myths. The cabin was meticulously clean, smelling of cedar oil, dried herbs, and the sharp tang of wood smoke. Several shelves were lined with actual books, leather-bound volumes of history, philosophy, and poetry that seemed wildly out of place in a mountain hermit's home. A large stone fireplace dominated the main room, casting a warm, flickering amber light that danced across the polished wood of the table and chairs. It was a home built by someone who valued order, yet there was a stark, undeniable truth at the center of the room. There was only one bed. It sat against the far wall, covered in a thick, heavy bear fur, a silent testament to the intimacy that was expected of a marriage, even one forged in the fires of desperation. Clara stood frozen by the hearth, the heat of the fire beginning to prickle her frozen skin as she stared at the bed. The weight of her situation finally threatened to crush her. The borrowed dress, the stranger who was now her lord, and the isolation of the peaks. Rowan noticed her gaze, his expression unreadable in the firelight. He stepped toward her but stopped well outside the circle of her personal space, his hands held open at his sides. "I know what you're thinking, Clara," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "And I want you to hear this now. This cabin is a sanctuary, not a prison. That bed is yours. There is a bolt on the door, and you will have the only key." He pointed toward a small secondary room partitioned off by a heavy curtain. "I'll be sleeping on a cot in the back. I won't cross that threshold unless you invite me, and I won't lay a hand on you unless you ask it of me. I married you to keep you out of Harlan Crow's hands, not to make you a victim of mine." Clara looked at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. In Pine Hollow, men took what they paid for. Her father had sold her, and by all rights of the territory, Rowan Blackwood owned her. Yet here he was, offering her a boundary that no one else had ever bothered to provide. The shock of his words left her breathless. She watched as he moved to the stove, his movements methodical as he began to prepare a simple meal of salt pork and hardtack soaked in broth. He treated her not like a prize or a servant, but like a guest he was bound to protect. "Why?" she whispered, the word barely audible over the crackle of the logs. Rowan paused, the firelight catching the sharp angles of his face and the haunted depths of his grey eyes. "Because the world down there is full of men who think they can own a soul with a piece of paper and a handful of gold. I've seen what that does to a person, Clara. I've seen it end in a way that can't be undone." He turned back to the stove, his shoulders tensed as if bracing against a memory. "In a year or two, when the dust settles and Crow finds someone else to torment, I'll give you the money to leave. You can go to Cheyenne or San Francisco and start a life where no one knows your name or your father's debts. Until then, you're safe here. You have my word on that." As she sat at the table and accepted the bowl he offered, Clara felt a strange, terrifying sensation. A flicker of hope that the monster of the mountains might be the only honorable man she had ever met. The first morning in the high country arrived not with the chime of a town clock, but with the rhythmic metallic scrape of a shovel against the hearth. Clara awoke beneath the heavy weight of the bear fur, her breath misting in the frigid air of the cabin. The transition from the fever dream of the wedding to the stark reality of the mountain was jarring. Through the frost-patterned window, the world was a jagged kingdom of white and slate. Rowan was already a blur of motion, his silhouette framed by the amber glow of the wood stove. He had already baked a loaf of dense sourdough bread, the yeasty aroma warring with the scent of pine resin and gun oil. There was no room for the languid movements of a valley morning here. The mountain demanded a tribute of labor before it allowed for comfort. As Clara sat up, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders, she saw that Rowan had laid out a set of heavy wool trousers and a thick buckskin jacket near the fire. They were rugged garments, built for survival rather than vanity. He didn't look at her as he spoke. His focus remained on the blackened coffee pot. "The mountains don't care about your dress or your name, Clara. They only care if you can stand against the wind. Eat. Today we begin the work of making sure you can." After a silent breakfast of bread and salted venison, Rowan led her out into the blinding glare of the clearing. The snow was knee-deep, a crystalline sea that swallowed sound. Rowan didn't take her to the woodshed or the stables. He led her to a row of fence posts where several rusted tin cans stood like tiny metallic sentinels. In his hands, he carried a Winchester Model 1873, a lever-action rifle that was the gun that won the West. He held it with a reverence that bordered on the religious. "Harlan Crow believes you are a prize to be collected," Rowan said, his voice as cold as the mountain runoff. "He believes that because you are dependent, you are a victim. I intend to prove him wrong. Real freedom isn't a piece of paper from a judge. It is the capability to say no and have the steel to back it up. If I am to be your husband, I will not be your jailer, but I cannot be your only shield. You must learn to be your own." He handed her the rifle. It was heavy, a cold length of walnut and iron that felt alien in her grip. He showed her how to work the lever, the mechanical clack-clack echoing through the silent trees like a heartbeat of war. The training was grueling. Rowan was a patient but exacting teacher, refusing to let her quit even when her shoulder turned a dark shade of violet from the rifle's recoil. He taught her the physics of the shot, how to account for the wind that whipped through the canyon, and how to lead a moving target. More importantly, he taught her the psychology of the weapon. "A gun is just a tool, like an axe or a plow," he told her as she fumbled with a fresh magazine. "It has no soul, no malice. It only does what the hand commands. If your hand is steady and your mind is clear, the tool will keep you alive. If you fear it, it is useless." By midday, Clara's hands were stained with black powder and her ears rang with the thunder of the shots, but she had managed to tumble 3 of the cans from their perches. For the first time in years, she felt a flicker of something other than despair. It was the intoxicating, terrifying sensation of agency. She wasn't just a daughter or a debt. She was a woman with a rifle, and in the wilderness, that was a transformation of the highest order. As the sun dipped behind the peaks, casting the clearing into long blue shadows, they sat on the porch to rest. The silence of the mountain felt different now, less like a threat and more like a shared secret. Rowan stared out at the ridgeline, his hands resting on his knees. "People in town wonder why I live up here," he said softly, his guard finally dropping. "They think I'm a madman or a ghost. The truth is, I'm hiding from the failure of men." He looked at her, and the grey in his eyes seemed to darken. "I had a sister once, Rebecca. She was 17, full of light, and she believed a man's word was his bond. A cattle buyer came through our valley, promising her the world. San Francisco, the ocean, a life of silk. He didn't take her to the coast. He sold her to a house of ill repute in Cheyenne. By the time I found her, the opium had already taken what the men hadn't. She died in a room that smelled of rot and broken dreams." The raw grief in his voice was a physical weight. "I couldn't save her because I wasn't there when the choice was made. I won't let history repeat itself with you." The revelation of Rowan's past acted as a bridge between them. Clara looked at the man the town called a devil and saw instead a soul forged in the fires of a specific, agonizing guilt. He wasn't protecting her out of a sense of ownership. He was protecting her as a form of penance. "I'm sorry about Rebecca," she whispered, reaching out to touch the rough sleeve of his jacket. He didn't pull away this time. "She would have liked this mountain," he replied, his gaze returning to the horizon. "It's honest. It doesn't lie about what it wants to do to you." Clara realized then that their marriage was a strange sort of alliance. Two people who had been betrayed by the civilized world, seeking refuge in the uncompromising truth of the wilderness. The borrowed wedding dress in the trunk felt like a relic of a different life, one she no longer recognized. Here, amidst the snow and the scent of gun oil, she was discovering a version of herself that didn't need a borrowed life. She was learning the architecture of her own survival. As they moved back inside to escape the encroaching night, Rowan paused by the door, his eyes scanning the trail they had climbed the day before. The wind had shifted, carrying a sharp, metallic scent that signaled a change in the weather. "There's a storm coming, Clara," he said, his voice dropping into that low, cautionary register. "Not just the snow. Marcus was right. Crow won't let this go. He's a man who measures his worth by what he can take from others, and he'll see our marriage as a theft." He looked at the rifle leaning against the wall, then back at her. "We have a few days of grace while the passes are choked, but when the thaw comes, the wolves will follow the scent. We have to be ready to turn this cabin into a fortress." Clara nodded, a new hardness settling into her jaw. She thought of Harlan Crow's predatory smile and her father's trembling hands. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now tempered by the weight of the Winchester. She wasn't just waiting for the end anymore. She was preparing for the fight. The blizzard arrived not as a sudden tantrum, but as a slow, suffocating erasure of the world. By the second hour after sunset, the wind had graduated from a whistle to a predatory howl, a sound that felt like it was trying to pry the very moss from the chinking between the cabin logs. This was the Great White Silence, a phenomenon the Ute and Shoshone tribes had respected for generations, and which the early mountain men had learned to fear as the White Death. The sky had vanished, replaced by a swirling, chaotic void of ice crystals that turned the air into a substance too thick to breathe. Every landmark, the woodshed, the corral, even the ancient pine that had stood for a century, was swallowed by the drifts. Inside the cabin, the heavy timber walls groaned under the atmospheric pressure, and the fire in the hearth flickered with a frantic energy as the downdraft fought to extinguish the only light for miles. For Clara, the isolation was physical, but it was also a psychological threshold. In the valley, winter was a season of muddy streets and extra blankets. Up here, it was an adversary that demanded total vigilance. The cabin had become a tiny, cedar-scented ember floating in a frozen universe, and the man across the room was the only other soul who knew she was still alive. As the storm intensified, the interior of the cabin became a classroom for a different kind of survival. Rowan spent the hours not in rest, but in a state of meticulous preparation that bordered on the ritualistic. He moved with a quiet, cat-like grace, his focus divided between the storm outside and the arsenal laid out on the heavy oak table. He showed Clara how to melt lead in a small iron ladle over the fire to cast fresh bullets, explaining the delicate balance of heat and cooling that prevented air bubbles from ruining the trajectory. This was the granular reality of the frontier. When the passes were choked and the supply lines severed, a man was only as rich as his lead and powder. He taught her the language of the hearth, showing her how to bank the coals with ash so the fire would breathe through the night without devouring their precious cordwood. There was a strange meditative peace in these chores, a way to anchor the mind when the wind outside threatened to tear the sanity from one's head. Clara found herself watching his hands, scarred, rough and powerful, and marveling at how they could be so precise with a mold and yet so terrifying with a trigger. The psychological tension between them hummed like a taut wire in the small space. Despite the storm's fury, Rowan remained steadfast in his promise of distance, never crossing the invisible line he had drawn near the sleeping quarters. However, the physical proximity of a shared life in a one-room fortress made every movement feel significant. Clara noticed things she had missed in the chaos of Pine Hollow, the way he tilted his head to listen to the timbers creak, identifying the weight of the snow on the roof, or the fact that he read his leather-bound volumes of Milton and Virgil by the failing light of a tallow candle. He was a man of profound contradictions, a mountain killer who valued the cadence of classical poetry, a hermit who lived by a code of honor more rigid than any town sheriff. During the long, dark hours, the silence between them began to lose its jagged edge. replaced by a mutual recognition of their shared exile. They were both refugees from a world that had tried to break them, and in this frozen sanctuary they were discovering that the mountain devil and the gambler's daughter were merely masks they had been forced to wear. The preparation for Harlan Crow's arrival continued even as the drifts rose past the windowsills. Rowan began the process of shuttering the eyes, showing Clara how to bolt heavy oak planks over the windows from the inside, leaving only narrow slits for a rifle barrel. He explained the concept of dead ground, the areas around the cabin where a man could hide, and how he had cleared the timber to ensure there was no cover for an approaching party. "Crow won't come alone, and he won't come fairly," Rowan explained, his voice low against the wind. "He'll wait for the first thaw, when the crust of the snow is hard enough to support a horse's weight. He'll send men who value gold more than their lives, and he'll expect us to be soft from a winter of hiding." He showed her a hidden trapdoor beneath a rug, leading to a narrow, hand-dug tunnel that exited into a rocky outcropping 50 yards behind the cabin. It was an escape route born of a survivor's paranoia, a secret umbilical cord to the wilderness. Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the draft. The realization that their home was also a potential tomb was a weight she had to learn to carry. By the third night of the storm, the transformation in Clara Hayes was nearly complete. The woman who had stood at the altar in a borrowed dress, trembling with the uncertainty of her fate, was being replaced by someone forged in the shadow of the mountains. She no longer looked at the Winchester with fear, but with a grim understanding of its necessity. She had learned to skin a rabbit with a steady hand, to read the subtle shifts in the fire's color, and to move through the cabin without wasting energy. Her anger toward her father was still there, a smoldering coal in her chest, but it had been joined by a fierce, newfound pride. She was a Blackwood now, not just by a legal contract, but by the shared struggle of the high country. As she looked at Rowan, sitting by the dying embers with his rifle across his knees, she realized that she was no longer waiting for someone to save her. She was learning how to stand beside him, a partner in a war that was only just beginning. The storm might have buried the world, but in the heart of the blizzard, Clara had finally found the ground beneath her feet. When the storm finally exhaled its last frozen breath, the world was reborn in a blinding crystalline white that felt like a physical assault on the senses. The oppressive grey vault of the blizzard had been replaced by a sky of such intense, polished sapphire that it seemed almost artificial. The silence that followed was not the absence of sound, but a heavy, resonant presence that amplified the smallest crack of a frost-split branch or the distant muffled thud of snow falling from a heavy bough. To Clara, emerging from the dim sanctuary of the cabin, the landscape looked like an unmarked ledger, vast, cold, and indifferent to the dramas of men. The drifts had sculpted the clearing into alien architecture, waves of frozen ivory that rose nearly to the eaves of the roof. Rowan was already at work, his breath forming thick, silver plumes as he shoveled a path to the woodshed. There was a temporary peace in the air, a fleeting truce offered by the mountain before the next hardship took hold. Yet beneath the beauty of the diamond dust glittering in the air, the reality of their isolation remained. The storm had acted as a barrier, but the clearing skies were now a window, and for the first time in days, they were visible to anyone with the patience to watch the heights. The following days were defined by the arduous labor of reclaiming their territory from the ice. Rowan led Clara into the forest, showing her the art of checking the snares that provided their fresh meat. He moved with a practiced ease on handmade snowshoes of bent ash and rawhide, teaching her how to distribute her weight to avoid breaking the delicate crust of the drifts. Every track in the snow was a story he translated for her. The frantic, zigzagging sprint of a snowshoe hare, the heavy, deliberate plod of a starving elk, and the light, ghostly prints of a hunting lynx. This was the informational wealth of the frontier, a specialized knowledge that turned the wilderness from a chaotic void into a readable map. As they worked, the psychological barrier between them continued to thin, replaced by a quiet, rhythmic coordination. Rowan spoke more frequently now, sharing details of the mountain's cycles, the way the springs would boil with the coming thaw, and how the grizzly bears would soon emerge, hollowed and hungry, from their high-altitude dens. It was a life lived in constant dialogue with nature, a sharp contrast to the stagnant, money-driven politics of Pine Hollow. Clara found herself marveling at the strength in her own limbs, her hands no longer trembling as she reset the traps. She was no longer a visitor in this harsh realm, she was beginning to belong to it. The illusion of peace shattered on the fourth afternoon after the storm's end. They were descending from a high ridge where they had been gathering windfall timber when Rowan suddenly froze, his body going as rigid as the pines around them. He didn't reach for his rifle immediately. Instead, he tilted his head, his nostrils flaring as he tasted the air. He signaled for Clara to stay low, his eyes fixed on a distant rocky promontory that overlooked the main trail leading up from the valley. From her vantage point, Clara saw nothing but shadows and stone, but Rowan's focus was absolute. He pulled a small brass spyglass from his coat and scanned the horizon for a long, agonizing minute. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, vibrating growl that sent a different kind of chill through her veins. "We're being watched, Clara. Not by the mountain, but by men." He handed her the glass, and through the circular frame she saw it. A momentary glint of light, a metallic flash that could only be the sun reflecting off a telescope or a rifle barrel. It was a single, distant figure, half hidden by a stand of firs, observing the cabin with the cold detachment of a scout. The wolves had finally found the scent. The realization that the grace period had expired transformed the atmosphere of the cabin from a sanctuary back into a fortress. The scouts were Crow's outriders, the eyes sent to gauge the strength of the mountain devil's lair and the resolve of the woman he had claimed. Rowan didn't panic. He became a machine of tactical calculation. "They won't strike while the snow is this soft," he explained, as they retreated to the cabin, moving in the shadows to avoid being spotted. "Horses would founder, and they'd be sitting targets on the open slope. They're waiting for the night freeze to harden the crust, or for the first true thaw to clear the lower passes. They're testing our patterns, seeing when we fetch water and when the smoke dies in the chimney." He began to prepare the dark defense, showing Clara how to position her weapon in the narrow firing slits so the barrel didn't protrude and give away her location. The psychological weight of being hunted was a new kind of pressure, a constant, buzzing vibration in the back of the skull. Every snap of a twig outside was now a potential threat, and every shadow cast by the moon was a possible assassin. Clara felt the old fear clawing at her throat, but she met Rowan's gaze and saw the iron there, and she forced the terror back into the dark corners of her mind. As the sun began to dip toward the jagged horizon, casting the peaks in a blood-red light that the mountain men called the alpenglow, the gravity of their situation settled over them like a shroud. This was the golden hour of the high country, a time of haunting beauty that often preceded the most brutal cold. Clara stood by the shuttered window, her hand resting on the cold steel of the Winchester, watching the long shadows stretch across the clearing. She thought of Harlan Crow, sitting in his mahogany-paneled office in the valley, moving men like chess pieces across a board he believed he owned. He was a man of the New West, a creature of contracts and bought law, but he was reaching into the Old West, a realm of lead and bone where his gold carried no weight. Beside her, Rowan was sharpening his hunting knife, the rhythmic shing-shing of the whetstone the only sound in the room. They were no longer just a husband and wife. They were a garrison of two, preparing to defend a life that had only just begun to feel like their own. The peace had been a gift, a brief respite to gather their strength. But the time for training was over. The mountains were watching, and the shadows were closing in. The night freeze arrived with a brittle, crystalline finality, turning the surface of the snow into a sheet of polished glass that could support the weight of a man or a horse. In the high country, this was the season of the hard crust, a brief window before the true spring thaw when the wilderness became a highway for those brave enough to traverse it. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with the scent of gun oil and the low, guttering flame of a single tallow candle. Clara sat by the eastern slit, her fingers tracing the cold walnut stock of the Winchester. She had learned to distinguish the natural groans of the timber from the deliberate, rhythmic crunch of a boot on ice. Rowan stood in the shadows, a silhouette of focused violence, his breathing so shallow it was almost imperceptible. He had extinguished the main fire hours ago to prevent the chimney smoke from giving away their exact positions in the dark. The silence was absolute until it wasn't. It began as a faint metallic jingle, the sound of a bit rattling or a spur catching, coming from the tree line. Then the shadows began to move, detaching themselves from the darkness of the firs. Three figures, hunched and cautious, were advancing across the moonlit clearing, their rifles held low. The wait was over. The first of Crow's wolves had arrived to test the strength of the mountain's gate. Rowan didn't speak. He simply touched Clara's shoulder, a brief, grounding contact that communicated more than words ever could. He signaled for her to take the lead rider, while he focused on the two figures trailing behind. The tactical logic was simple. Disrupt the leadership, and the rest would hesitate. Clara adjusted her sight, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She remembered Rowan's voice from the weeks of training. Don't pull the trigger. Squeeze it like a secret. She sighted down the barrel, aligning the iron notch with the dark mass of the man's chest. The lever-action Winchester was a masterpiece of 19th-century engineering, a weapon that offered a significant rate of fire compared to the single-shot rifles of the past. As the lead man reached the 20-yard marker, a scorched stump Rowan had designated as the kill zone, Clara felt a strange, cold clarity wash over her. The fear was still there, but it was a distant thing, secondary to the mechanics of the shot. She exhaled half a breath, felt the world narrow down to the tip of her front sight, and squeezed. The rifle kicked into her shoulder with a familiar, bruising force, and the muzzle flash illuminated the clearing in a momentary, jagged strobe of orange light. The crack of the rifle shattered the silence, echoing off the cliff face like a thunderclap. The lead man didn't fall immediately. He buckled, his rifle spinning away as he clutched at his side, the impact of the .44-40 round throwing him off balance. Before the echoes could die, Rowan's heavier Sharps rifle roared from the other side of the cabin, a booming report that signaled a much larger caliber. One of the trailing figures was knocked backward as if struck by a physical hammer, his body disappearing into a drift. The clearing erupted into chaos. The remaining man dived for cover behind a fallen log, his own weapon spitting fire toward the cabin. Bullets thudded into the heavy logs with a dull, wet sound, spraying splinters of cedar across the floor. Clara felt a sharp sting on her cheek as a shard of wood grazed her skin, but she didn't flinch. She worked the lever with a mechanical precision she hadn't known she possessed, the brass casing clattering onto the floorboards with a bright metallic ring. She wasn't thinking about the man she had hit. She was thinking about the sight alignment, the distance, and the survival of the man standing in the shadows behind her. This was the iron baptism, the moment the gambler's daughter became a combatant in a war for her own soul. As the smoke began to curl through the firing slits, the third man realized the mathematics of the engagement had turned against him. His companions were down, and the cabin was returning fire with a discipline that suggested a much larger garrison. With a frantic shout, he scrambled backward, dragging the wounded lead rider toward the safety of the trees. Rowan fired one last shot, not to kill, but to discourage any thought of a second rush, the bullet kicking up a spray of ice inches from the retreating man's boots. Then, as quickly as it had begun, the skirmish was over. The clearing returned to its frozen silence, though the air now carried the acrid, biting scent of burnt powder. Clara leaned her forehead against the cool wood of the shutter, her breath coming in jagged gasps. Her hands were shaking now, the adrenaline receding to leave a hollow, vibrating ache in its wake. Rowan moved toward her, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't take the rifle from her, he simply placed his hand over hers on the stock. "They're gone, Clara," he said, his voice a low, steady anchor in the dark. "You held the line. You did what had to be done." The acrid fog of black powder lingered in the cabin's rafters long after the echoes of the Winchester had faded into the mountain's granite folds. Inside the dim room, the silence was no longer a sanctuary. It felt heavy, vibrating with the residual energy of the violence that had just transpired. Clara stood by the firing slit, her knuckles white as she gripped the rifle's lever. Her ears rang with a persistent, high-pitched whine, a common physiological response to indoor gunfire known as tinnitus, which frontier doctors of the era often ignored, but mountain men respected as a badge of the trade. She looked down at the brass shells littering the floorboards, gleaming like spent gold in the moonlight. These tiny cylinders were the physical remains of her transformation. She had pulled the trigger, she had felt the resistance of the sear and the violent kick of the explosion. Out there, in the unforgiving white of the clearing, red stains were blooming in the snow. The reality of what she had done began to settle in her gut like a stone. She wasn't just a victim of a gambling debt anymore. She was a participant in the brutal, kinetic history of the West. Rowan moved through the shadows, his presence calm and grounding. He didn't offer empty platitudes or false comfort. Instead, he took the rifle from her hands and leaned it against the wall, then led her to the hearth where the embers still glowed with a dull, subterranean red. He knelt to stir the coals, the firelight catching the deep-set lines of his face. "The first time is always a ghost that follows you," he said, his voice a low rumble that cut through the ringing in her ears. "People in the valley talk about shooting as if it's a game of cards, but there's a weight to it that never leaves. You didn't do it for sport, Clara. You did it for breath. In the high country, the line between living and dying is often the width of a firing pin." He looked at her, his grey eyes reflecting the dying fire. "Violence is a heavy coat to wear, and once you put it on, you never truly take it off. But remember this, you gave those men a choice at the tree line. They chose Crow's gold over their own lives. You only chose to stay alive." The conversation shifted from the philosophical to the tactical, as Rowan produced a piece of evidence he had recovered from the porch during a brief, daring scout after the shooters fled. It was a silver-headed cane topper, shaped like a vulture's head, a signature accessory of Harlan Crow. It had likely fallen from the pocket of the lead scout, a man Crow trusted implicitly. The presence of such a personal item signaled a chilling shift in the land baron's strategy. Crow wasn't just sending expendable hirelings anymore. He was likely leading the vanguard himself, or at the very least he was close enough to oversee the destruction of the Blackwood sanctuary. This was a violation of the unspoken frontier code, where men of status usually stayed behind the safety of their mahogany desks while the regulators did the dirty work. Crow's ego had been bruised by the loss of his property, and his personal involvement meant the next wave would not be a mere test of the cabin's defenses. It would be a scorched earth campaign designed to leave nothing standing. As the first light of dawn began to bleed over the eastern peaks, Rowan began the process of hard-point fortification. He explained to Clara that they needed to prepare for a multi-directional assault. He showed her how to set percussion alarms, small tripwires attached to hanging tin cups filled with pebbles, around the blind spots of the cabin. This was an old tactic used by fur trappers in grizzly country to provide a few precious seconds of warning. He also began to redistribute their ammunition, placing go bags of lead and powder near the escape tunnel. "Crow thinks he's coming to a wedding he missed," Rowan muttered as he checked the tension on a tripwire. "But he's coming to a fortress. We've shown them we have teeth. Now we have to show them we have a heart that won't stop beating." Clara watched him, her fear replaced by a cold, sharpened resolve. She realized that the man she had married was more than a protector. He was a teacher of the most vital lesson the world had to offer, that your life belongs to you, but only if you are willing to hold it with a closed fist. By midday, the mountains seemed to hold their breath. The alpenglow of the previous evening had been replaced by a flat, oppressive grey that suggested more snow was on the horizon. The atmospheric pressure was dropping, a sure sign of an incoming cyclonic storm that could bury their struggle in a fresh layer of anonymity. Clara stood at the table, methodically cleaning her Winchester, her movements mirroring Rowan's. She thought about her mother, a woman of soft words and hard labor, who had died believing that endurance was the only virtue. Clara was discovering that endurance was only half the battle. The other half was the willingness to strike back. She looked at the silver vulture head topper on the table, a symbol of the man who thought he owned her. In the silence of the cabin, she made a silent vow. Harlan Crow might come up this mountain as a baron, but he would leave it as a ghost. The final act was approaching, and for the first time Clara felt ready to write the ending herself. The final siege did not begin with a roar, but with a chilling, calculated silence. As the sun dipped behind the western peaks, casting the valley into a deep, indigo gloom, the atmospheric pressure dropped so sharply that the cabin's timbers seemed to tighten in anticipation. Outside, the hard crust of the snow had become a sounding board. Even the weight of a fox could be heard for 100 yards. Clara stood at the northwest firing slit, her breath forming small rhythmic clouds in the frigid air. She had transitioned from the frantic terror of the first skirmish into a state of combat cold, a psychological numbing that allowed her to focus on the mechanics of the Winchester. Beside her, Rowan was a statue of dark wool and iron, his gaze fixed on the tree line. He knew the psychology of a man like Harlan Crow. Crow wouldn't just rush the door. He would attempt to break their spirit before he broke their bones. The land baron was a student of attrition, a tactic where one wears down an opponent's resources and resolve until surrender feels like a mercy. The first sign of Crow's personal presence was the arrival of a white flag, held aloft by a man who moved with the cautious, jerky steps of someone who knew he was being watched through a dozen iron notches. He stopped well outside the kill zone and hammered a stake into the frozen ground. Attached to it was a letter, weighted down by a heavy gold-set signet ring, the very ring Crow had used to seal the contract for Clara's life. Rowan retrieved the message during a tense interval, moving with a blurring speed that Clara could barely track. The letter was not a request for negotiation, it was a bill of sale, rewritten to include the interest accrued by their resistance. Crow claimed that for every man wounded in the previous night's exchange, a year of Clara's life would be added to her service in his household. It was a grotesque parody of legal documentation, a reminder that to Crow the law was simply a tool for his own appetites. "He's close," Rowan whispered, his voice like grinding stone as he tossed the letter into the hearth. "He's using the darkness to position his regulators in the dead ground behind the rocks. He thinks the gold ring will remind you of what you owe the world of men." He looked at Clara, his grey eyes catching the orange flicker of the dying fire. But he forgot one thing about the mountains. Up here, gold has no weight. Only lead carries any gravity. Rowan began to reveal the final layer of their defense, the deadfall. He had rigged several heavy logs above the main approach, held in place by a series of slip knots that could be triggered from inside the cabin. It was a primitive but devastating form of area denial, a way to turn the very landscape into a weapon. Clara watched as he checked the tension on the lines, realizing that her husband had spent years preparing for a day when the world would come to collect its debts. The psychological warfare intensified as the moon rose, a cold, silver eye that illuminated the clearing in a ghostly, flat light. From the darkness of the trees, Crow's voice suddenly echoed, amplified by the natural bowl of the cliff face. It wasn't the voice of a monster. It was the voice of a civilized man, smooth, educated, and dripping with a patronizing pity. "Clara, my dear," the voice drifted through the logs. "You are playing a dangerous game with a man who has nothing to lose but his soul. Rowan Blackwood is a ghost of a dead era. He cannot give you a future. He can only give you a grave. Walk out now, and I will forgive the blood on your hands. Stay, and I will ensure that by dawn this cabin is nothing but a memory of ash." The words were designed to sow cognitive dissonance, making Clara question the morality of her choice. In the silence that followed, Clara looked at her hands, stained with soot and lead, and then at the man who had taught her how to hold a life of her own. Rowan didn't counter the words with his own. He knew that silence was the only response to a predator's logic. He simply moved to the table and began to distribute the final stand ammunition, rounds he had specifically hand-loaded with a slightly heavier powder charge for increased stopping power. He explained the ballistics of the upcoming fight, showing her how the bullets would behave when passing through the soft pine of a horse shield or the heavy wool of a winter coat. This was the informational depth of their bond. He wasn't treating her as a damsel to be shielded, but as a soldier to be briefed. The tension in the cabin reached a breaking point, a static charge that seemed to make the very air hum. Clara realized that the Baron of Pine Hollow was no longer just a man to her. He was the personification of everything that had tried to keep her small. The attack began with a sudden, violent eruption of suppressive fire. Bullets began to hammer against the cabin walls from 3 different directions, a rhythmic thud crack that filled the room with the smell of pulverized wood and old dust. Crow's men were using volley fire, a military tactic designed to keep the defenders' heads down while a secondary team advanced. Clara dived for her position, the Winchester's stock familiar and cold against her cheek. She didn't wait for Rowan's command. She saw the movement in the dead ground, a group of men carrying a heavy beam to use as a battering ram. She worked the lever, the mechanical clack, a defiance to the storm of lead outside. The final siege had transitioned from words to iron, and as Clara sighted down the barrel, she knew that the only debt she would be paying tonight would be measured in grains of black powder and the weight of her own resolve. The heavy oak door didn't just break, it detonated under the rhythmic impact of the battering ram. Outside, the night air was a frantic swirl of snow and muzzle flashes, turning the clearing into a strobe-lit theater of war. Rowan had already triggered the deadfall, a massive trunk of Douglas fir rigged with a trigger pin and heavy tension wire. As the first wave of Crow's men charged, the log swung through the darkness with the momentum of a falling mountain, the kinetic energy enough to crush bone and shatter the ram. The scream that followed was swallowed by the roar of Rowan's Sharp's rifle, but Crow was prepared for the price of entry. Even as the deadfall took out the front runners, more figures surged through the gap, their faces masks of soot and greed. The shuttering of the eyes had provided cover for as long as possible, but the sanctity of the cabin was now a memory. The conflict had transitioned from a long-distance exchange to the brutal, claustrophobic reality of close-quarters combat, a melee, where the length of a barrel was a liability and the edge of a knife was the only truth left. Clara found herself pushed into the corner near the hearth, the heat of the fire a sharp contrast to the ice-cold terror clawing at her throat. A man, his coat stiff with frozen mud, lunged through the splintered doorway, his eyes fixed on the Winchester in her hands. She didn't have time to cycle the lever. The space was too tight, the air too thick with the dust of pulverized wood. She remembered the hand-to-hand basics Rowan had drilled into her during the long storm, the leverage of the hips, the vulnerability of the soft tissue, the psychology of the strike. As the man reached for her throat, she used the brass-plated butt of the rifle as a hammer, swinging it in a short, violent arc that connected with his jaw with a sickening, wet crunch. It wasn't the clean, distant violence of the shooting range. It was a sensory overload of smell, sound, and the raw vibration of bone-hitting wood. She scrambled back, her boots slipping on the spent brass casings that now covered the floor like slick metallic scales. Across the room, Rowan was a blur of calculated movement. He had discarded his empty rifle, drawing the heavy Bowie knife he had sharpened with such ritualistic care. This weapon was a frontier multi-tool, a massive blade with a clip point designed for both piercing and slicing, a staple of the southern dueling tradition that had migrated to the mountains. In the flickering firelight, he moved with the economy of a predator, his strikes precise and final. He wasn't fighting for honor or land. He was fighting to keep the breach from widening. However, for every man he put down, another seemed to rise from the snowy dark of the porch. The sheer mathematics of attrition that Crow had predicted were beginning to weigh on them. The cabin, once their sanctuary, felt like it was shrinking, the walls closing in as the smell of blood and burnt powder became an oily film on Clara's skin. The turning point came when a voice, authoritative and cold, rose above the din of the struggle. "Enough!" Harlan Crow stepped into the cabin, a pistol in his left hand, his right arm cradled in a silken sling, a souvenir from Rowan's earlier warning shot. He looked out of place amidst the gore and the splintered wood, his silver hair still perfectly groomed, his presence a jarring reminder of the civilized world that had sent these men to die. He didn't look at Rowan, he looked at Clara, his eyes narrowed with a possessive, frustrated rage. "You've made quite a mess of my investment, Clara," he said, his voice a low hiss against the crackle of the fire. "But a broken prize is still a prize. And as for your mountain devil..." He turned the pistol toward Rowan, who was held at bay by two of Crow's remaining regulators. The standoff was no longer a tactical problem. It was a moral abyss. Clara felt the weight of the moment press down on her. The Winchester was empty, her pistol was across the room, and the man who had taught her how to be free was seconds away from becoming a ghost. She looked at the escape tunnel rug, then at the man who thought he owned her. In that instant, the informational wealth Rowan had given her, the knowledge of the cabin's secrets, the physics of the structure, the psychology of the hunter, converged. She wasn't just a gambler's daughter anymore. She was the architect of her own fate. Without a word, she reached for the heavy iron kettle sitting on the edge of the hearth, its contents a boiling slurry of fat and lye she had been rendering for soap. It was a weapon of the hearth and home, a domestic tool turned into a chemical deterrent. As Crow began to squeeze the trigger, Clara launched the contents toward the men holding Rowan, the searing liquid creating a momentary agonizing distraction that broke the iron grip of the regulators. The chaos that followed was a blur of kinetic energy. Rowan, freed for a heartbeat, dived for his revolver, the mechanical click-spin of the cylinder a death knell in the small space. But Clara didn't wait for him to finish it. She lunged for the small, hidden pocket pistol a .31 caliber Derringer Rowan had secreted behind a loose stone in the chimney and leveled it at Harlan Crow. This was a last-ditch weapon, inaccurate beyond 5 feet but devastating at point-blank range. Crow froze, the barrel of his own pistol wavering as he looked into the eyes of the woman he had tried to buy. He saw no fear there, no currency of desperation. He saw only the cold, hard logic of the mountain. The fracture in the cabin's piece was complete, and as the firelight danced off the barrel of the Derringer, the Baron of Pine Hollow finally realized that some debts can only be settled in the currency of the soul. The air inside the cabin was a thick, suffocating soup of charcoal dust, vaporized lead, and the metallic tang of blood. Outside, the blizzard hissed against the logs, but inside, the world had shrunk to the space between Clara's finger and the trigger of the .31 caliber Derringer. Harlan Crow stood paralyzed, the flickering firelight casting his shadow across the splintered floorboards like a distorted, reaching claw. For the first time in his life, the Baron of Pine Hollow was facing a balance sheet that gold couldn't balance. He looked at Clara and then at Rowan, who had regained his footing, his revolver leveled with a predator's stillness. The power dynamic of the frontier had been stripped to its most primal form, the man with the money versus the woman with the iron. Crow's face, usually a mask of aristocratic indifference, had collapsed into a map of raw, naked terror. He realized that the mountain devil wasn't the one he should have feared. It was the wife he had tried to buy, now transformed into a vengeful guardian of her own sanctuary. The standoff was broken not by a shot, but by the weight of Crow's own cowardice. As Clara's aim remained unmoving, the land baron's hand began to tremble, his expensive pistol wavering. "You won't do it," Crow hissed, though the conviction in his voice was a dying ember. "You're a Hayes. You're soft. You don't have the stomach for the stain this will leave." Clara didn't blink. She remembered the psychology of the defender that Rowan had whispered during their midnight drills, that the weapon is only as effective as the will behind it. "I'm not a Hayes today, Mr. Crow," she replied, her voice as cold as the ice on the eaves. "I'm the woman you tried to bury in the snow, and the mountain has a way of making people harder than they ever thought possible." Seeing the finality in her eyes, Crow's resolve shattered. He dropped his weapon, the heavy steel thudding into the dirt and wood, a sound that signaled the absolute end of his empire. With the leader disarmed, the remaining regulators, men who were paid to kill, not to die for a lost cause, lost their appetite for the struggle. They saw Rowan's steady hand and Clara's unshakable focus and realized the mathematics of survival had turned against them. One by one they backed toward the shattered doorway, disappearing into the white void of the storm. Rowan didn't pursue them. His priority was the perimeter. He moved with a grim, efficient grace, disarming Crow and binding his hands with a length of rawhide. The Baron was now a prisoner in the very cabin he had come to burn. The silence that followed was heavy, a vacuum that rushed in to fill the space where the gunfire had been. Clara lowered the Derringer, her breath hitching as the adrenaline began its slow, painful retreat. She looked at the wreckage of her home, the splintered door, the spent brass, the spilled lye, and realized that while the cabin was broken, she was finally whole. The immediate aftermath was a visceral lesson in frontier reality. Rowan was wounded, a shallow furrow across his ribs where a regulator's bullet had found a gap in his wool coat. Clara, her hands still vibrating from the tension, had to put her informational training to use. She gathered the clean linens she had prepared and the bottle of high-proof medicinal whiskey they kept for emergencies. Rowan guided her through the process of wound debridement, explaining how to wash away the debris and soot to prevent the black rot that claimed so many lives in the high country. As she worked, her touch was steady despite the chaos in her mind. She saw the scars on his body, marks of older wars and harder winters, and understood that this man was a mosaic of survival. They were tending to the physical toll of their stand, a quiet, domestic rhythm that felt like a prayer of gratitude in the wake of the slaughter. By the time the first grey light of dawn began to seep through the shutter slits, the storm had finally broken. The clearing was a graveyard of broken timber and red-stained drifts, but the air was clear and the silence was absolute. Harlan Crow sat in the corner, a huddled, broken figure stripped of his finery and his pride. He was no longer a baron. He was merely a man waiting for the law to find him. Rowan stood by the shattered door, looking out at the jagged peaks as they caught the first golden rays of the alpenglow. He turned to Clara, his expression unreadable but his eyes soft. "It's over, Clara," he said, his voice a low, tired anchor. "The mountain held. You held." Clara walked to his side, looking out at the world she had fought to keep. The price had been high and the scars would remain, but as she looked at her husband, she knew that the mountain devil and the gambler's daughter had achieved something more than just survival. They had earned the right to see the sun rise on a world they finally owned. The descent from the high country was a journey through a world that had been fundamentally altered, though the mountains remained as indifferent as ever. The hard crust of the snow had begun to soften under the influence of a premature Chinook, a warm, dry wind that heralded the true spring thaw. As Rowan led the horses down the narrow switchbacks, the rhythmic clop-squelch of their hooves echoed the heartbeat of a new reality. Behind them, tied to a packhorse and slumped in a state of catatonic shock, was Harlan Crow. The Baron was a shadow of his former self. His fine wool coat was stained with the grime of the cabin floor, and his silver hair was a tangled nest of defeat. He was no longer the apex predator of Pine Hollow. He was a piece of evidence, a living testament to the failure of greed when confronted with the steel of the human spirit. Clara rode beside Rowan, her Winchester slung over her shoulder, her gaze fixed on the valley below. She wasn't the same woman who had climbed these trails in a borrowed dress. She was returning to the civilized world with the eyes of someone who had seen the raw, unvarnished truth of survival. As they neared the outskirts of Pine Hollow, the news of their descent seemed to travel on the wind itself. By the time the muddy main street came into view, a crowd had gathered, the same faces that had watched Clara's funeral wedding, with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. But the atmosphere was different now. The whispers weren't about Rowan's devilry or Clara's misfortune. They were hushed tones of disbelief. To the townspeople, the couple was returning from the dead. They saw the shattered remains of Crow's vanguard and the bound figure of the man who had owned their mortgages and their futures. Clara felt the weight of their collective gaze, but she didn't look away. She sat tall in the saddle, her jaw set, her presence a silent challenge to everyone who had stood by while she was traded like currency. The town was a mirror, reflecting the cowardice they had practiced in the name of propriety, and Clara was the light that made them blink. The confrontation at the sheriff's office was a clinical exercise in frontier law. Rowan didn't barge in with threats. He presented the facts with the cold precision of a ledger. He laid out the silver vulture head cane topper, the forged bill of sale, and the testimony of the surviving regulators who had been rounded up by a local posse. Sheriff Miller, a man who had spent years looking the other way when Crow's name was mentioned, found himself staring at a mountain of evidence that could no longer be ignored. The informational wealth of the high country had been translated into a language even a bought lawman had to respect. As Crow was led away to a cell that smelled of pine oil and damp iron, the town seemed to exhale a breath it had been holding for 20 years. The Baron was caged, not by a rival's gold, but by the courage of the two people he had dismissed as expendable. Clara's final encounter with the town took place in the center of the muddy street, where Mrs. Garrett and Sarah Dennison stood waiting. They looked at her with a combination of shame and wonder, as if trying to reconcile the gambler's daughter with the woman standing before them. "We thought you were lost, Clara," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Clara looked at her former friend, then at the church where her life had been sold. "I was lost," Clara replied, her voice steady and clear. "I was lost in a world where you all watched me be traded like a head of cattle and called it unfortunate. I was lost in a town that valued Harlan Crow's money more than a woman's soul." She adjusted her reins, her eyes scanning the faces of the crowd. "I didn't find my way back because of the law or because of luck. I found it because I learned that my life is mine to defend. You all saw a monster in Rowan Blackwood, but the only monsters I found were the ones sitting in the front pews of that church." The psychological impact of her words was a silent explosion. The social standing that had once seemed so vital to Clara was revealed to be a hollow shell. She saw her father, Thomas Hayes, standing at the edge of the crowd, his face a map of regret. He moved toward her, his hand reaching out as if to touch the hem of her cloak, but he stopped short. There were no words for what he had done, and no apologies that could bridge the gap. Clara didn't hate him anymore. The mountain had burned the hatred out of her, replacing it with a quiet, distant pity. "The ranch is yours, father," she said, her voice devoid of heat. "Rowan paid the debt. Use the second chance to be the man my mother thought you were." Without waiting for a response, she turned her horse back toward the mountains. The town was a place of ghosts and debts, and her heart now belonged to the high, clean air of the peaks. As they rode back toward the tree line, the sun began to dip, casting the alpenglow across the jagged teeth of the range. Rowan reached out, his hand finding hers in the space between their saddles. It was a simple gesture, but it carried the weight of everything they had survived. They were no longer a forced marriage or a mountain devil and his prize. They were partners, forged in the iron baptism of the siege, bound by a truth that the valley could never understand. The road ahead was still steep, and the winters would always be hard, but as the first stars began to pierce the twilight, Clara knew that they weren't just returning to a cabin. They were returning to a life they had earned with every grain of black powder and every beat of their own hearts. The reckoning was over, and the mountain was calling them home. The true spring thaw arrived in a glorious, violent rush. The hard crust surrendered to the sun, and the mountainside became a symphony of rushing water and shifting earth. The silence of winter was replaced by the roar of the spring runoff, as the icebound creeks transformed into churning turquoise torrents that carried the debris of the old year down into the valley. For Clara and Rowan, this change in the world mirrored the internal shift within their own walls. The cabin, once a fortress of desperate defense, was becoming a place of slow, deliberate healing. They worked together to repair the fracture of the siege, replacing the shattered oak door with timber they had hand-milled from a fallen cedar. The scars on the logs from Crow's bullets remained, dark, indented reminders of the night the world came to collect, but they were no longer jagged wounds. They were part of the cabin's story, just as the scars on Rowan's ribs and the new hardness in Clara's gaze were part of theirs. In the long, golden afternoons of May, the informational wealth Rowan had shared with Clara began to yield a different kind of harvest. They didn't just survive, they cultivated. Clara planted a garden in the fertile silt near the creek, using seeds she had saved from her mother's old ranch and techniques Rowan had learned from the indigenous traders who occasionally traversed the high passes. She learned the botanical lore of the range, which roots could be dried for medicine and which berries could be preserved for the lean months. The Winchester still stood by the door and the deadfall was kept in working order, but the primary focus of their lives had shifted from the mechanics of death to the rhythms of growth. They were building a legacy of self-sufficiency that was the true antithesis of the debt-driven economy of Pine Hollow. Up here, they were governed only by the natural law of the seasons, a code that was harsh but fundamentally honest. The psychological distance that had defined the early days of their marriage had dissolved into a profound, unspoken synergy. They moved through the chores of mountain life like two parts of a single machine, a coordination born of the night they had held the line against 7 armed men. Rowan no longer slept behind the curtain. The mountain devil had found a peace that the valley had denied him, and Clara had found a strength that didn't require a borrowed dress. They spent their evenings by the hearth, the firelight dancing across the leather-bound books that had once seemed so out of place. Rowan would read aloud, his voice no longer a low growl of warning but a resonant, calm presence that filled the room. They weren't just a husband and wife by contract. They were partners by choice, bound by a shared history of resistance and a mutual respect for the freedom they had carved out of the granite. As the years turned, the story of the High Sanctuary became a piece of regional folklore. Travelers and trappers spoke of a cabin where the law of the Baron didn't reach, and where a woman with a Winchester stood as a sentinel for her own soul. Pine Hollow eventually moved on from the shadow of Harlan Crow. The Baron died in a prison cell in Laramie, his empire dismantled by the very mirror of justice he had tried to manipulate. Thomas Hayes, true to his word, worked the ranch until his hands were too gnarled to hold a shovel, eventually leaving the land to a community trust rather than a gambler's whim. But the real legacy was on the mountain. Clara and Rowan became the silent guardians of the high country, a testament to the idea that agency is not something granted by a judge, but something forged in the fire of necessity. They never returned to the valley to live. They had found a higher truth in the white silence and the jagged peaks. The final scene of their struggle was not a battle, but a moment of profound, quiet victory. On the anniversary of the siege, they climbed to the glass horizon, the high promontory where they had first spotted Crow's scouts. The world below was a tapestry of green and gold, but the air up here was still sharp with the ghost of winter. Rowan took Clara's hand, his grip firm and steady. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked, his voice caught in the wind. The wedding, the mountain, the weight of the lead. Clara looked out at the vast, uncompromising wilderness that had become her home. She thought of the currency of desperation and the iron baptism, and the woman who had once stood at an altar in a borrowed dress. "I regret the world that forced us to choose," she said, her voice clear and absolute. "But I would choose this mountain and this man 1,000 times over. Because up here, Rowan, I am finally the owner of my own breath." They stood there until the alpenglow turned the peaks into a kingdom of fire, a husband and wife who had survived the worst of men and the best of storms. Their story was a reminder that in the harsh, kinetic history of the West, the most powerful weapon was not the rifle or the knife, but the unyielding resolve of a soul that refused to be sold. As they turned to walk back toward the cabin, their sanctuary, their fortress, their home, the stars began to pierce the indigo sky. The mountain was silent, the war was over, and the legacy of Clara and Rowan Blackwood was written in the very stone of the high country. They were free, not by a piece of paper, but by the weight of their own choices, and in the heart of the wilderness, that was the only truth that would ever endure.